Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Anastasia Zhivaeva and I'm a CG specialist at Chaos Group. Today, I'm happy to share with you how to create an architectural visualization in a few simple steps using V-Ray for Rhino 6. We have been working with the McNeil team to make sure that the new V-Ray update runs smoothly with Rhino 6 and that we support the new implemented features. They have added a lot of new material parameters and material presets, and rendering them with V-Ray won't be a problem. At any point, you can convert them to a V-Ray material and continue editing in the asset editor. For Grasshopper users, we have added a new tool for V-Ray in Grasshopper, like proxies, animation, and many more. In my project today, I will use some of the exciting improvements that are coming with the new update for V-Ray 3.6. In this webinar, I will guide you through the process of developing a concept, and I'll break down the steps for creating a daytime render. Once you switch to Rhino, you will see how easy it is to adjust the camera, set the frame, and add elements to the environment such as proxies and grass. After that, I'm going to proceed with changing the lighting, adding and editing materials, all the way through to working with atmospheric effects to create depth in the image. Then I will set my project for final rendering and will show you how to do color corrections directly in the frame buffer. For those of you who are interested in more precise post-production, I'll show a basic compositing using render elements. Now let's go ahead and start with a few words about the project itself. The building I will use in this project was designed by a colleague of mine, Ivan Kozaliev. It is inspired by contemporary architecture and the surroundings. The house is planned for a natural environment and a warm climate. This influenced the design. The building has a lot of window openings connecting the interior with nature. Concrete and glass were chosen for materials, as well as wood, to add more warmth to the design. One of the first steps that I will do when starting a project is to gather some references that inspire me. In a lot of cases, the references like mood images, camera position, or vegetation, for example, will come from a client. In situations when it's all up to you, don't feel limited to look for references related only to architecture. They could include landscape photography, movie stills, product design, art, and so on. Examining the collected references can help you clarify the overall idea for the image. Keep an eye open for a common theme or repeating elements. This could be the type of vegetation, for example, the weather or time of the day, materials, or overall colors and feel. This all leads to the important part of choosing the mood for the image. Sunny clear day or hazy dusk scenery, choosing the mood now will guide you in the right direction right from the start. Of course, a crucial part in the concept plays the building itself. Selecting which parts of it need to be shown or are more interesting will save you a lot of time later on when you are already working with a 3D model. For this project, I had a few ideas for the view. First one, showing more of the slanted surfaces, and a second one that brings the focus more to the house and the space in front of it. I went for this view because I wanted to experiment with the reflections of the windows and to emphasize the shape created by the slanted surfaces. Once the view is selected, it's time to decide on the composition of the image. Unfortunately, this is not a straightforward topic, and a whole webinar could be dedicated talking just about composition. Nevertheless, there are some principles and tools that can help you improve your renders. When working with composition, paying attention to lines, shapes, camera positioning and framing, as well as to the hierarchy of the objects, could have a drastic impact on the image. The views that I showed were intentionally black and white. At the start, seeing the image without any color will help you determine which elements stand out visually and will make it easier to balance the silhouette. What caught my attention in this view was the presence of diagonals and implied triangles. This is an effective way to add some dynamics to the image and help focus the attention on important elements. Leaving empty space around the main subject is another step that shouldn't be overlooked. Not filling the whole frame with the building will help create a sense of simplicity and balance. Making a simple sketch of the concept for your project is not a necessary step, but it will be really helpful and time-saving as it will work like a guidance. Now, let's go ahead and jump into Rhino. As you can see, I already have the geometry of the house and the landscape. I'll switch to one of the viewports and open the asset editor. Before I begin working on the project, I'll switch to a GPU rendering engine and enable the hybrid rendering by clicking on the dots next to it and selecting the C++ CPU. I have chosen to work on GPU because on my computer I have a powerful graphics card that will allow me to render fast during this webinar. The main benefit of the hybrid mode is that it will take advantage of the CPU's computing power. V-Ray CUDA is rendering on both CPUs and GPUs and producing the exact same results. Although I will be using GPU for rendering, all the steps that I will go through are the same for a CPU workflow as well. Next, I will enable the interactive rendering, which will allow me to see every update that I make to the scene. An important step is adjusting the frame of my camera. I always switch on the save frame, the blue and the orange lines that appeared, which will indicate what my camera sees. Next, I'll select an aspect ratio. You can choose between different presets and adjust them depending on your project or change to a custom one. It's important to select the aspect ratio at the beginning, as I will build the rest of the scene based on that. In my case, I will change it to 2:1 and increase a bit the width and the length. When setting the final render, I will adjust the resolution to higher values, but the aspect ratio will stay the same. For the initial V-Ray settings, I have the default preset set to architectural, but it could be changed based on the type of a project. To do so, I used V-Ray change default scene command and selected ArchViz. It will load V-Ray Sky in the Environment tab on startup of a project or on scene reset, as well as set the camera exposure to avoid overbright result. I will enable material override because I already have some materials applied to the geometry. This will overwrite everything in a light gray color, but the material can be used as well. Don't worry, we will apply and edit the most interesting shaders later. Okay, let's see the result. Right now it looks a bit dark. When using the architectural preset, the sun is not going to be enabled by default, so I'll have to go and turn it on manually. We can do that directly in the Lights tab as well as adjust the intensity. Same can be done for light sources in the scene if you have any. I think the result is fine for now, so I'll leave the lighting as it is and will adjust it once I add the details to the environment. Speaking about the environment, when working with exteriors, I always use proxies for the vegetation. Trees and plants, all of them can be quite heavy geometry with millions of polygons. Having 2 or 3 of them might not be an issue, but when you want to create a small forest to use as a backdrop, they can significantly slow down your viewport. So instead, I will import some trees in my scene as proxy, which will create a low poly representation of the geometry in the viewport, but will render as high poly geometry. I'll place it somewhere in the scene and copy it around. The tree was created in 3ds Max and then exported as a proxy. You can find a lot of assets and libraries created in various softwares and import them in this way. Another option is to create a mesh in Rhino and from the button in the same rollout, export it as a proxy and use it in a different software. In the Geometry tab of the Asset Editor, you can notice that after copying the proxy as it is, new paths were created. Same thing will happen for every new copy of the proxy, even though the tree is the same. I don't want that, and instead I will delete the copies and make the proxy a block. I'll use Rhino's block command, give it a name, something like proxy. And now, regardless of how many times I'll copy it around, it will stay as one object in the asset editor. At any time, I can easily change the preview type of the mesh. Look how the trees in the camera viewport will change. There are a few options such as bounding box, a point preview for even simpler representation, or you can even change it to see the whole mesh. You can switch between them depending on what you find more convenient. Be aware that depending on your V-Ray proxy object detail, using it in whole mesh preview type can put substantial load on your system. I have already taken time to place the trees around according to my concept, so I'll just delete the new one and enable a layer called trees. You can see that this is the same tree, simply rotated and scaled, as well as I added some plants. And this is how my scene looks at this stage. Now I want to show you how I created the grass in front of the building. I separated the landscape in 3 sections. Since I'm going to see only part of the ground, I have created a smaller segment and will add grass only to it by selecting it and clicking on the V-Ray Fur icon in the toolbar. In the Asset Editor Geometry tab, you can see that now I have V-Ray Fur object. Let's wait for the rendering. I'll use render region for a faster update. Since material override is enabled, it will render in this light gray color, and even if I make changes to it, it will be difficult to see. By default, the fur will use material assigned to the geometry it is on, or currently this surface, which has a soil material applied to it. Instead, I want to use a separate material just for the fur. I will enable the material rollout and will load a grass material that I added from the material library. This way, the ground and the grass will have different materials. Next, I'll click on the icon next to it and in Material Options, disable the Can be overwritten checkbox. When disabled, the material will not be overwritten by Material Override option in the Settings tab. This can be done for any other material, and it is especially helpful when you're working with interiors and you can override the glass. Now that it's easier to see, I'll start to do adjustments to the grass. It's obviously too short, so I'll need to increase the length of the strands to something like 22. The length will be measured in scene units, or in this project I worked in centimeters. That's much better now. Right here, the grass looks very fuzzy and dense, more like a fur or a blanket. That can be changed by adjusting 2 parameters. And first, I will begin with the strands per area parameter. I'll try to lower it to 0.3 as I don't want the grass to look so dense. Then I will increase the thickness value of the strands to something like 0.9. Now this result looks more like grass. I can leave it like this, but you will hardly ever see such an even result in real life. I'll use the Variance tab where you can find the values that control the variety for the direction, length, thickness, and gravity, and I'll adjust the first 2. This will add more variation to the direction and the length of the strands and will make it look more uneven and realistic. To improve it even further, in the density map, I will load a new Noise B procedural map. By the way, we have rearranged the procedural maps in categories, so they are easier to find now. I tested some values and I like the result with these. It will create regions where the grass is almost not growing and we can see the ground showing through, which will often be the case in real life. The white parts will be ground material once we finish working with the shaders. I'm going to use Grasshopper as a sort of a scattering tool. Grasshopper is a plugin for parametric modeling and it now comes with Rhino 6. It has become a very important tool for architectural industry, and in my project I'll use it as an easy way to copy objects around. For more detail, I will add some dandelions to this part of the ground. Spreading them around manually can be a tedious process, especially when it should be done for a larger segment. I have a file prepared for the webinar. Here you will see notes for populating geometry and randomization. I'm going to use the same surface for the points and instance the flowers on them. Next, I need V-Ray VR Scene Importer component to load the files of the dandelions. It could be found in V-Ray Toolbar Geometry category. I'll extract the file path parameter where I'm going to load the VR Scene files. 3 versions of the dandelions with slight variation were created in 3ds Max, and with materials applied to them. After that, I exported each of them as a VR scene. Soon, it will be possible to instance proxies and selecting materials for them in Grasshopper. Next, I need to connect the geometry components with the points, as well as with the randomization nodes. By adding the V-Ray render node, I can render the flowers right away, no additional components are needed. But since they are in the grass, I want to render them directly in my scene and see how they look together. Let's place render in project component and see the result right away. Obviously, they look too big right now, so I need to adjust the scaling values, and that's the great part. You can render your design without baking. My geometry is still interactive. I'll try a different value for scaling and rotating. And I think increasing the count is also needed. Let's render again in the project and see if the new values will produce a correct result. Great, that looks much better now. To speed up the rendering, I'll disable the dandelions for now, and I'll do the same for the grass. I'll enable them back later when I'm done working with materials. Before proceeding to the next step, I want to make some final adjustments to the lighting by creating more interesting shadows. I have placed 2 tree proxies behind the camera. Although I cannot see them in the render, they are placed there on purpose. I want to achieve a look where I have 3 shadows falling on the grass, the path, and the building. It is possible to get that look by manually adjusting Rhino sun, but there is a quicker way to change the sun position from the direction I want. Let's first turn off the Rhino sun. Then select the V-Ray Sun Creation panel, check Manual Control, place it somewhere in the scene, and I'll work with top and front view. And by simply rotating it directly in the viewport, I can get the look that I want. At any time, the manual control can be disabled, so don't hesitate to test it out during your work process. I experimented with different directions and found the result I like, so I'll delete the sun just created and will enable the one I have already positioned, and it's called the sun shadows. To see it, I'll have to turn on the layer it is on. And there you go, I have the shadows where I want them to be. Right now they appear very sharp, so depending on the time of the day or the look you want to accomplish, you can make them appear softer by changing the size multiplier. The higher the value, the more blurred will be the shadows. I'll leave mine at 3 as it gives them a more softer appearance. One last detail to the environment. I will enable a layer called background. Essentially, these are 4 simple surfaces positioned behind the building and with a standard material applied to them. I used an image of mountains in the diffuse slot for all surfaces and a mask in the opacity slot to make the sky part transparent. I added them simply to create sense of depth in the scene. This was not part of the initial concept and was added during the developing stages of the project. Alright, I'm happy with the overall result and now I'm ready to move on to materials. Starting with disabling material override. As mentioned at the beginning, I already have some of the shaders applied to the smaller elements in the scene, but majority of my project is without any materials. I will start with the proxies. They're rendering in various colors because they do not have specific material information. Once you load them in the scene, you will need to reapply materials that you want. Proxies come with placeholders for the shaders. Here in my case I have 4, but they could vary depending on the face IDs that were created when exported from the software. To create face IDs when exporting geometry as proxy from Rhino, I would first apply materials to the mesh, then use the export as proxy tool. This will automatically create the face IDs. For my scene, I have prepared one simple material for the bark and 2 for the leaves. I'll show you how I created them. I'll start with a simple generic material. In the diffuse slot, I'll use an image of a leaf. I have only one bitmap for the diffuse of all leaves, but if I use it everywhere, they will all look the same. When creating shaders for vegetation, I prefer to use some kind of bitmap. The reason is that if you use just a color, the greenery will look artificial and the human eye can very easily recognize that. The color correction node will give me the freedom to do basic adjustments to the image, like changing the hue, correcting the saturation, or when it's needed, adjusting the brightness and contrast of the image. To make the leaves look more lively, I'll add reflections to them. I'll slightly change the color to blue because I want to enhance the reflection of the clear sky, and I'll lower the glossiness so the reflections will be more blurred. Also, I'll increase the reflectivity by adjusting the IOR and set it to 2. An important thing to do here is to check the box that says backside reflect. This means that the reflections from the backside of the leaves will be calculated as well, and that's what I need since not all of them are facing the camera. For the bump slot, I'll just copy the diffuse and bring the saturation all the way down to make it black and white. Now, if I use this material directly for the leaves, they will look like a solid shape. A great solution is to use two-sided material to simulate thin, translucent surfaces like paper, cloth curtains, and tree leaves, because the material allows seeing the light on the backside of the objects. I'll proceed with selecting the shader I just created in the front material slot, and for the back, I'll just create a duplicate of the front material, give it a different name so it's easier to identify, and slightly change the saturation. I can use the same front material, but creating a difference between them will add even more variation in the colors. Those were the steps that I followed when I created all materials for the leaves. Now let's replace the colors of the proxies with the actual shaders. At any time I can make corrections or even replace them with different materials. To quickly switch to the corresponding material, just click on the icon next to the arrow. You can see now in the render the initial colors are being replaced. Alright, moving on to the building. For the house, I will use shaders from the material library. As mentioned in the beginning, concrete and wood were chosen for the materials of the building. I'll draw a region and focus just on this part. Currently, we have over 500 ready-to-use shaders, and you can drag and drop them directly in your project or use them as a base and build on top of those materials. Let's begin with the glass windows. I will select all the glass elements and assign a simple glass material from the library with a right-click over the material and choosing Apply to Selection. This will automatically add it to my material list. I want to make the glass more reflective, and a quick way to do that is by increasing the reflections IOR. Let's try 5. Great, both windows are looking okay. Let's move on to the concrete structure. For it, I will use a shader called Concrete Flooring, but first I need to select all the elements as they are currently not at the same layer. And then I'll apply the shader in the same way. Right now it looks too dark. I was thinking of something more brighter. Instead of going to an external application to adjust the color of the diffuse, I'll again use the color correction node. This time I'll adjust only the brightness and contrast. In the swatch, I can see that now it looks more like the result I want. Here you can notice that all of the edges of the building are quite sharp. This is not something that we will see in real life because everything has at least a little bevel. I can improve the way it looks in two ways. Either work with the geometry of the house and model bevels, or, and that's what I'm going to do here, I can use an edge texture that will create all the bevels during render time. I can use this texture in the bump slot of the material, but this particular shader already comes with the bump map and I don't want to replace it and lose additional detail. Instead, I'm going to create a bump material, assign the concrete as a base, and use an edges texture for the bump. I'm going to increase only the size to make it more visible. The edges procedural map will not only create a look of smoother edges, but will also add a bit more detail. I'll apply it by selecting Use as a replacement, choose my current material, and select Replace. This is very helpful, especially when the material is applied to objects in different layers. You no longer have to find and select each one of them. This texture is not going to modify in any way the actual geometry in the scene. It's a great solution when you don't have enough time to model all the details and the objects is not seen up close. Here at the edge, I can notice some highlights. This effect is subtle but has a significant impact on the final result. Right next to the house, I have a segment where I want to create gravel. For that, I'm going to use a standard generic material and I'll just quickly rename it. For the diffuse, I have prepared seamless texture of gravel. Then, to create the look of pebbles, I will use displacement with a grayscale bitmap with a lot more contrast to it. I'll select the pad geometry and assign this material to it. For displacement, you can use textures or procedural maps. Let's see how it looks. I have a feeling that the texture won't fit the way I want it to. Yes, you can definitely see that the pebbles look too small, so I'll adjust the tiling of the bitmaps. Here in Texture Placement Rollout, I'll change the repeat UV values. Smaller amounts mean that the bitmap will be repeated less times on the surface. Same for the diffuse, because I want it to match with the displacement texture. I'll try 0.3 here as well. That's much better. I think the size is okay now. And two things before we move on, I'll add a bit of reflectivity to this material. In real life, even the roughest materials have some reflectivity, so it's a good practice to add it to the shaders in your renders. And I can also increase the strength of the displacement. Okay, all materials are now assigned. Let's take a look at the whole image. I'm going to disable region rendering. I'll turn on back the grass and will enable the render in project component in Grasshopper. Alright, I have all the elements I need in the environment, the lighting is set, and all shaders are assigned. Depending on the project, that could be the last step before rendering. In my case, there is one more thing that I want to work on. I think it looks good, but the mountains look like they are too close to the camera and the building. In real life, the further away are the objects from us, the less saturated and sharp they will appear. A quick and easy way to achieve that is by enabling the volumetric environment. If you are wondering which one you should use, aerial perspective or environment fog, I'll explain the difference. The environment fog can scatter light from the environment and all light sources in the scene. Results like volume rays can be achieved only by using it. When I'm not aiming for such effect, I will use aerial perspective. It simulates light scattering from the sun and sky, which makes it faster effect to calculate. Adjusting visibility range will affect the density of the aerial perspective. Lower values will make it appear more dense, and bigger will reduce the effect. The height controls how far from the ground this effect will be visible. Let's try 50 and see how it looks. I will also change its color and add a blue tint. Depending on your project or concept, you can easily create different looks. There we go. At this stage, I feel comfortable to render my image. Once you have done with setting everything in your scene, don't forget to check the overall result. Setting the project for final production rendering is the simplest step of all that I showed you today. It's as easy as adjusting a couple of sliders. What I'll need to do is, first of all, disable the interactive rendering, then adjust the preset of the quality, and in the render output, increase the resolution of the image. And that's it. All I have to do is to hit the render button and wait for the render to finish. Okay, but what happens when you don't have enough time to wait for the final image? When I need a quick preview without a lot of noise, I simply use the V-Ray denoiser. Let's set the render quality to draft, enable the denoiser, and try the result with the mild preset. While waiting for the render, I'll tell you more about it. The denoiser takes an existing render and applies a denoising operation that detects areas where noise is present and smoothens them out. Speed reduction of the rendering process can go up to 50% depending on the scene. This makes it a great tool when you don't have enough time to wait for a better quality image. It will improve the render on top of the quality you have selected in the render settings. So for final production rendering, I recommend using a higher quality preset. Let's see the result. Using the switch to RGB icon, I can change back and forth between the denoised image and its initial state. There is still some noise in this area here, so let me change the preset to strong and hit update. You can choose between 3 different presets or even set a custom one. I like this result more with a strong preset. For those of you who have a lot of projects at the same time or very short deadlines, we have a new service coming soon, V-Ray Cloud. Using it doesn't require any additional knowledge related to setting up machines or installing other plugins. In this case, I'll just change the quality to high and select the cloud button. It will open a page in the browser and start analyzing my scene. From here, I can name my project, add it to specific folders or create new ones, and click Submit. The project will be uploaded together with all the assets. This is great when, for example, you need to render a high-quality image in a very short time, or you need to use your machines for another project. V-Ray Cloud is a native integration in V-Ray for Rhino, for Revit, SketchUp, Maya, as well as 3ds Max. It leverages the massive scalability of the cloud computing through a workflow that removes entirely the complexity of dealing with third-party service providers, network setups, or virtual machines. It is built for scalability, so there is no single part of it that cannot be instantly replicated, started, or replaced. This means that unlike physical machines, even if a virtual machine fails, another one takes its place immediately without a single moment of service interruption. I can follow the progress directly in the browser and at any time pause it or even cancel it, upload multiple scenes, and set priority for one of them. In the jobs queue will be listed all current rendering jobs, and they can be accessed directly from the list. I'll leave it to render while I continue working. I have a rendered on the cloud version of my image, and let's load it in the frame buffer. Clicking on the H icon will open frame buffer history. You can set a specific folder where you can save your image at different stages and compare the progress or various changes. Without having to go to an external application, I can do adjustments right here in the frame buffer. That saves time from learning and working with another post-production software. You will find here many different tools, such as exposure. By clicking on the checkbox, I can enable or disable each one of the options. With a slider, I can change the white balance. Higher values means the image will appear warmer, or make it colder with lower values. In case I made changes that I don't like, I can always reset them by choosing the reset from the options icon. Very often, I use color balance as it allows me to experiment with shadows, midtones, highlights, or all of them together. Curves is another powerful tool that can help you enhance the render. I usually go for a sort of a S shape. And once I'm done with the color corrections, I can save them as a file for use in a different project or load other color corrections that I have prepared before. This is especially useful when you have several render views for the same project and you want them to look cohesive. And if you want to have more control over the post-production, you can always switch to Photoshop and use render elements to refine your image. Render elements can be added from the Render Element tab. For recreating the beauty pass, you will need atmosphere, background, global illumination, lights, reflections, refractions, specular, and self-illumination. You can find them in the drop-down menu or just type directly the name of the render element you need. If you don't have some of the elements, like in my case there is no self-illumination, you can simply skip it. We have added a new render element called Multimatte, which will create RGB passes. They are especially helpful when you want to adjust a specific object in post-production. For the Multimatte render element to work, I'll just need to select an object and set its render ID from the properties. I have already assigned IDs to the elements in my project, and this is how the render elements will look. You can toggle between them directly in the frame buffer. Now let's switch to Photoshop and I'll show you what I will usually do. Once I have everything ready, I will add all render elements as a stack. That can be done by going to File, then Scripts, and Load Files into Stacks. Then select my render elements and click OK. Oh, and here is a notification that my render on the cloud is already finished. That was quick. We'll check that one later. Using the load files into stacks will create one file with all render elements inside, but keep in mind that the render elements have alpha by default and it will be loaded as a transparency. Depending on the project you work on, that might be alright, but for this one I wanted to have control over the alpha. So instead, in the file here, I dragged and dropped all the render elements as alpha channel. To recreate the beauty pass, I'll select all the render elements and change their mode to linear dodge add. This already looks like my render in the frame buffer. Next, I will do adjustments to some of the elements. The gravel path looks a bit overexposed to me. I'll select the red channel from the corresponding multimatte, then create a clipping mask so it applies only to the lighting layer and slightly adjust it. And I think I want to do the same for the house, but increase the values to make it brighter. I will follow the same workflow. First, select the red channel for the structure, create a new adjustment layer as a clipping mask, and brighten it up. Using multi-matte channels allows you to do a very quick selections and this way apply corrections only to the parts that you want. I think I lowered the exposure too much for the pad, so let me just quickly adjust it. I will go through the same steps for the global illumination layer and again we'll create a clipping mask. Every render element can be adjusted in this manner and at any time you can go back to correct the result. Here is before and after adding the adjustments. For the reflections, I want to do the same thing, brighten them up by adjusting the exposure to higher values. We are almost done. Let's work with the atmosphere layer as well. Exposure adjustment layer will make the effect more pronounced. And to match its color better to the sky, I'm going to add a photo filter adjustment layer. If, for example, you change your concept, that's a great way to adjust the look. Here is before and after adjusting the atmosphere render element. A few final touches. For the overall image, I will use the color adjustment that I made in the frame buffer. I have saved it in advance with a cube extension. You can load different files and compare them or even combine them. I'll slightly decrease the opacity of this layer as I think right now the effect is too strong. And this is the result before and after working with the render elements. For the final image, I took this result and refined it using simple brushes to add highlights and color balance adjustment layers. Let's switch to the cloud notification. Once the rendering is ready, I can view it in the browser, on my phone, or directly download it. This is a great way to turn your machine into a supercomputer. The service is in a private beta and you can apply to test it out and see how it fits in your workflow. Okay, that was from me for this session. I hope you found today's webinar helpful and interesting. You can try all these new features and improvements and see how they work for you by downloading a 30-day free trial. And if you would like to learn more about V-Ray, I encourage you to check our page docs.chaosgroup.com, where you can find more in-depth info of the different features. Also, visit our webpage chaosgroup.com for the latest updates and releases. And don't forget to check our YouTube channel Chaos Group TV, where you can find a lot of tutorials. Thank you for being part of this V-Ray experience. See you next time. Bye.